Oh, so today we're going to discuss activism and the body. And I'll make reference to the reading from the syllabus, which looks at pro-choice activism and the law.
Lourdes Rivera, Senior Vice President of U.S. Programs at the Center for Reproductive Rights. Take one. On March 4th, the Center for Reproductive Rights will be back at the Supreme Court challenging an abortion restriction that has been adopted by the state of Louisiana that the Supreme Court in 2016 already ruled was unconstitutional because it posed an undue burden on women's ability to access abortion. We're going to have not just excellent lawyers arguing inside the court, but we are going to have a tremendous rally outside of the court because it's so important for the court to know that people are watching, that people expect the court to uphold the rule of law, to uphold precedent, and that this is not going to be decided under the radar.
So Radhika Rao has written an essay about privacy and property law and the body. And Rao asks, what kind of autonomy do we have in our bodies? Is it the autonomy that individuals possess over a piece of property, or is it the autonomy guaranteed under the constitutional right of privacy? So the law of the body is currently in a state of confusion and chaos. Sometimes the body is characterized as property. Sometimes it is classified as quasi-property, and sometimes it is not conceived as property at all, but rather as the subject of privacy rights. So regardless of the legal language that is employed, property and privacy constructions of the body converge to the extent they secure identical interests, namely the right to possess one's own body and the right to exclude others from it. The two diverge, however, in their concept of the relationship between the person and the body. Property envisions a person who owns and is thus distinct from his or her body, while privacy views the person as embodied and the body as personified. Under property theory, the body is theoretically capable of separation from its owner, whereas under privacy theory, the two are indivisible and inextricably intertwined. So Rao discusses instances where the body can be thought of as property, such as in cases of organ donorship or blood donation. However, Radhika Rao also discusses privacy laws, and in the past, privacy laws were used to discuss the rights of people who are pregnant to have an abortion. And this has obviously changed considerably.
So are you able to see my...
This is a clip of Dr. Radhika Rao discussing Roe versus Wade and Dobbs versus Jackson in the future of reproductive rights and justice.
Yes? And just one small tiny correction, which is I did give a presentation, but not to Zuckerberg General Hospital, actually to UCSF Medical School. So similar, but not exactly the same thing. They have something called Grand Rounds, where you speak to all of the physicians and staff and people at UCSF medical school. And so I was invited by Dr. Bob Wachter. Some of you may have been following him. He's become a very big guy in the news lately because they're always interviewing him about COVID. So anyway, he interviewed me last week at UCSF Medical School, and I am giving, as Brody said, the exact same presentation that I gave them last week. I decided that it worked well for a general medical audience, so I think it should work well for all of you as well.
Dr. Wall, could you start the PowerPoint so the slide will be bigger on our screen? Or not?
Yes, I'll do it in the slideshow mode.
Thank you.
So there. You see it? So this presentation is called Roe, Dobbs, and the Future of Reproductive Rights and Justice. And it tells you who I am. As Brody tells you, I'm a professor of law and a Harry and Lillian Hastings Research Chair at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. So I'm starting off just by giving you the provisions of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which are the provisions that have governed in this situation. And specifically, there are two parts of the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, which have been invoked in cases involving the right to terminate pregnancy, the right to an abortion. The Due Process Clause says that no state can deprive any person of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that has been interpreted to include not only fair procedures, but substantive rights as well. And then the Equal Protection Clause says that no state can deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. So these are the constitutional provisions that I'll be referring to today. But I thought I would start off by describing for you, before I talk about the leaked opinion and the latest case, the background to this is, of course, Roe versus Wade in 1973. So as Brody said, before Roe versus Wade in 1973, there was no constitutional right to terminate pregnancy, to have an abortion. But in Roe versus Wade, the court confronted this issue, the Supreme Court confronted this issue for the first time. And by the way, that's a picture of Justice Harry Blackmun, for whom I worked at the US Supreme Court. And I've got that picture up because he was the author of Roe versus Wade. So the opinion that pronounced a constitutional right to an abortion. What happened in Roe versus Wade? Well, it was a case coming out of Texas. Texas, which is very much always in the news, including this past week. But Texas had a law that made procuring an abortion a crime, except by medical advice for the purpose of saving the life of the mother. So unless the woman's life was at stake, she could not have an abortion. It was illegal in Texas. And the Supreme Court said that this law was unconstitutional. They relied upon an unenumerated right to privacy that's grounded in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And what do I mean when I say unenumerated right? Well, the Constitution, this document that I've got here, nowhere mentions the word privacy. It doesn't explicitly protect any right to privacy. But the Supreme Court held that the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause, contains this unenumerated right. And here's the language of the court's opinion in Roe. Quote, the Constitution does not explicitly mention any right of privacy, but the court has recognized that a right of personal privacy or a guarantee of certain areas or zones of privacy exist under the Constitution. And then the opinion continued. This right of privacy, whether it be founded in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty, as we feel it is, or in the 9th Amendment, that's another constitutional provision, this right of privacy is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. That's the language of the court's opinion in Roe versus Wade in 1973. Before I get to the framework which the court articulated in Roe versus Wade, I should give you a little bit of background about Mr. Justice Harry Blackmun, the man whom I worked for, who authored the opinion in Roe. Before Justice Blackmun was appointed to the US Supreme Court, and by the way, Justice Harry Blackmun was a Republican. Before he was appointed to the Supreme Court, he was appointed by President Richard Nixon. So he was not considered to be, this liberal icon that today he is kind of held out to be. At the time that he was appointed to the court, he was viewed as a Republican. But I think the Republican Party back then was really a very different kind of a Republican Party than it is today. And you'd never see Justice Blackmun is a rarity, unheard of in today's climate. But anyway, before he was appointed to the US Supreme Court, as I said, he was a Republican. But not only was he that, he actually was the chief legal counsel for the Mayo Clinic, the medical clinic, one of the most eminent medical institutions in the United States, in Rochester, Minnesota. He was the lawyer for all of those physicians. And so he really understood about doctors and the practice of medicine before he even became a judge. And so when Roe versus Wade came before the US Supreme Court, I'm telling you now some background history that is not widely known. At the time that Roe came before the US Supreme Court, that first year that Justice Harry Blackmun was appointed to the court, there were two justices on the court, Justices Harlan and Justice Black, who were very old, and they suddenly retired for reasons of bad health, and later they died. So the court was short of two justices. Instead of the full court of 9 justices, they had only 7 justices on the court. So Chief Justice Warren Burger, who was Chief Justice at the time, appointed what he thought to be a screening committee. He didn't want a court with only 7 justices to take cases that would be controversial, because if you decided a case with 7 justices, it could be decided by a majority vote of 4-3. But if you had 2 more justices appointed to the court, it could go 5-4 the other way. So he established a screening committee, and the purpose of this screening committee was to choose only cases with this short court that were non-controversial. And Justice Blackmun told me that he was one of the members of this screening committee. And he said that there were a couple of other justices assigned to the committee too. And he said one of the non-controversial cases that they selected for the Supreme Court to hear that term was Roe versus Wade. So it gives you a sense of how different the political climate at that time was. They didn't realize that abortion was going to be this incredibly controversial issue that would plague the court for the next 50 years, for the next half century.
So I'll stop it there, and when I post the slides online, you can look at the full lecture, specifically if you're thinking about writing about abortion for your final project. Radhika Rao discusses the ways that autonomy and ideas of autonomy are central to how the law is used to construct bodies as entities with rights, but also as capital and as private lives. So if one thinks about the human body as a private life, then it lends itself to the concept of privacy. So if my body, my thinking body is actually my life, then it is obviously my private life. My thoughts are mine, my voice is mine, my habits are my own. However, if we think about the human body as property, then I essentially own my body. And the concept is then more difficult to imagine that I actually just own a body and there is something else outside of me, I guess, like my mind is not necessarily the same as my body. So I own a body. And I think that the property arguments are much more difficult to understand from a philosophical perspective, unless we think about the ways that the human body is not just the property of me, but the property of the state. And therefore, if it is the property of the state, then when I die, I could give organs to someone, or if I have blood, I could donate blood. And it's also about things like conscription. I could be called upon to go to war, but I think it is also about incarceration. So if I have a body and it is property, but it is not just my own property. Say it is the property of the country in which I live in, then that means I could also be incarcerated. And if I have a body that is property, then it could also be someone else's property, which means that if you are a child, then your parents are then responsible for your body. And in some ways, you could think about how this could be useful. So if I am someone who has lost control of my mind and body, and I need some sort of care, then there are times when the state could intervene because I could be a threat to others or to myself. So if I have severe mental health and addiction issues, then there are times when the state could say that I need a caretaker because I'm a threat to myself and to others. So if I was homeless and I was on a whole series of drugs, or I was severely depressed or had schizophrenia, then the state could perhaps intervene to try to save my life. So the fact that I am property also means that I am cared for. My body is cared for if I cannot care for myself. If we look at the human body in terms of privacy, my body is my life, my mind is my life. That means I could also destroy my life. And in the process of destroying my life, I could do harm to others. So one could think about these ideas of privacy and property, and the ways that they are useful depending on the claims that one wants to make about individual people and cases. Rao writes, if autonomy consists of the right to resist invasions of the body and to open one's body to others in the context of intimate and consensual relationships, the body should be envisioned as a subject of privacy interests. But if autonomy consists of the power to instrumentalize the body by extracting value from it and exchanging it with others, then the body should be considered a form of property. It follows that property in the body is necessary in order to protect commercial value and to provide a legal framework that governs the interests of strangers, whereas privacy suffices to preserve an individual's rights in his or her own body and to safeguard the relational interests of family members. So it's interesting to think about property, privacy, and this idea of the family in relation to issues that we've discussed, such as transgender and queer rights. So if my body is property and autonomy consists of the power to instrumentalize the body by extracting value from it and exchange it with others, then can this value be about my capacity to have children with a heterosexual partner? In Canada, this obviously could not happen. Gay rights is really comprehensive, queer marriage exists, transgender rights exist. So if, for example, my body is supposed to have value and exchange with others because of gender identity, then this would not really make sense in the context of Canada because Canada has comprehensive rights protecting transgender rights. So then we come to privacy. So privacy suffices to preserve an individual's rights in his or her own body and to safeguard the relational interests of family members. So who is my family? So if I have my individual rights and my body is my life, then who are my family members and what are their relational interests? In Canada, is quite clear that you can have a chosen family and you can identify as transgender or queer, and your chosen family can also be your legal family, which is why Canada has comprehensive rights protecting gay marriage. India most recently decided against gay marriage. So the problem with this idea of privacy and property and the power to instrumentalize the body and the relational interests of the family are all really starkly and sometimes brutally clear in cases where people are transgender and lesbian and gay and do not want to use their body to reproduce a certain lineage of people and do not want their supposed life or their imagined life to be safeguarded by heterosexual family members who are not their chosen family. So privacy theory secures a limited form of self-ownership without permitting rights in the human body to be conveyed to others, and it shields intimate associations, but not arm's length transactions. Dead bodies and severed body parts, on the other hand, are not sheltered under the umbrella of privacy because they are no longer inextricably intertwined with a person. As a result, they may be transferred to others or seized by the state without loss of personal identity. Accordingly, to afford individuals a limited degree of autonomy over their bodies after death or separation from the person, these objects should receive at least some protection under the law of property. So it's again really interesting to think about privacy versus property, especially in Canada, because Canada does have comprehensive rights regarding transgender rights and gender reassignment surgery. Canada also has very comprehensive laws protecting people with disabilities. So in previous lectures, we've discussed people with disabilities and disability theory. So this idea of privacy and property is very important in our time period, and specifically in relation to Canadian law and who can claim rights over a body. And people with disabilities, I think, and the disability rights movement are often really clear about these ideas, are often really forthright in acts of writing and protest about autonomy and the right to one's life. At the same time, if someone is property or if the human body is property, it means that the social welfare state must also provide certain provisions for this person. And the right to care is also a central right. So just thinking about privacy, I have my own private body, I can do what I want with it, is not about care from others, which is about responsibility for a body, not about individual personal responsibility. So the article syllabus this week looks at extremism and militant forms of left-wing extremism that followed the decision to change abortion laws and to make abortion illegal or only legal with certain conditions in many states in the United States of America. So Durand showed that left-wing extremist violence had increased in the previous 5 years, including 17 homicides during the Trump administration, though right-wing extremism remains responsible for more attacks and fatalities. Durand found that some of the left-wing attacks were directly in response to right-wing attacks, though the victims had no connection to the right-wing incidents. The program on extremism, drawing on FBI data, identified only 7 anarchism-related domestic terrorist incidents from 2015 to 2019, some of which involved planning mass casualty attacks.
موتناش الصاروخ بده يموتنا الجوع. هنا بالنسبة لنا الخيم مش
battle lines are drawn. A year on, since millions of Americans were blocked from accessing a 50-year right, an abortion,
You are a murderer!
the debate is as divisive as ever. On one side is a group who believe they're the last line of defense before an innocent life is taken.
I come here to offer help and hope to women that come here.
What if the help that that woman needs is to have an abortion?
Well, I'm not going to help anyone have an abortion.
On the other side are pro-choice volunteers known as swans who formed last summer and offer to shield patients.
We can help you, young lady.
I'm sure that some patients wish that no one was out here. But if we all look stupid and we all look absurd, then at least they don't look scary. You know what I mean?
It's not long before the two sides collide.
You told someone the other day who had a toddler, you said, oh, kill that one and let the other.
No. I was using their own ridiculous way of reasoning. I said, why don't you kill one of them and let this one live?
You say, oh, we really could have helped you.
We could have.
But is that something they need to hear when they just had a medical procedure?
You mean when they killed their baby?
How is
Yes.
12 months on, how are restrictions on essential healthcare impacting America? We start our story in Alabama, which had been blocked from banning terminations until last summer, when the US Supreme Court reversed the Roe v. Wade ruling, and lawmakers in individual states were handed the power to decide. The procedure is now illegal here, unless there's a serious risk to the mother, with no exceptions for rape or incest.
I'm Allison Molman. I live and work in Montgomery, Alabama with my partner Steph and our farm of 2 dogs, 3 cats, and 2 chickens.
Allison found out she was pregnant in January, but on Valentine's Day, her worst fears came true.
I went to the bathroom and when I wiped, I saw blood. And so I called my OBGYN. She showed us the ultrasound photo and she just told me there's nothing we can do. This is a pregnancy that just like, it's not gonna make it. And she got kind of choked up actually. And she kept saying, I wish there was more I could do for you. And in that moment, I didn't know what that meant. I thought she just was like giving condolences.
Doctors in Alabama who perform an abortion which isn't deemed to be life-saving risk up to 99 years in prison. While miscarriage treatment is not part of the ban, pro-choice advocates say the way the law is written makes it challenging for health workers to provide care without endangering their license. Allison's doctor could have offered her abortion medication, which speeds up the miscarriage process. Instead, she was forced to wait for it to happen naturally.
It has been one of the worst weeks of my life. Just kind of feeling like I'm in purgatory. I've lost a fair amount of tissue and blood in the last week, and so I'm hoping that everything is passed naturally. I'm nervous. I want this to be over.
Desperate, Allison drove several hours to get help from another clinic in Tuscaloosa. Once one of Alabama's only abortion providers, since Roe was overturned, it's now a non-profit reproductive health service. It promises to offer medical interventions for non-viable pregnancies. So if Allison had come here first, she would have had that option.
It's something that I've seen happen more than a few occasions where people who would otherwise should have been helped were not. And fortunately, find care here and have that care that they need before something irreversible happens, whether that's death or a hysterectomy because of an infection. Abortion is healthcare. You don't have to like it. But that politicization, the criminalization of this aspect of healthcare makes it so healthcare providers are afraid.
So over the past year, patients in Alabama who've wanted or needed an abortion have had to travel hundreds of miles, normally by car and often to Florida. Now, this neighboring state does have restrictions in place, but the 15-week ban is far more permissive compared to other parts of the Southeast. But as I think we're going to see, Florida's reproductive care system hangs in the balance. Once upon a time, the home of Disney was viewed as a swing state, but it slipped out of the Democrats' reach in recent years.
This game, you're not ready for it.
Florida's governor, Ron DeSantis, is one of the leading candidates for the Republican presidential nomination, and his right-wing policies have propelled him, such as his 15-week abortion ban.
These are unborn babies that have heartbeat, they can feel pain, they can suck their thumb.
Months later, he was re-elected,
Florida held the line.
and it was a landslide win. What would you say to people who think Governor DeSantis is just trying to out-Trump Trump? He wants to be the next president, and he doesn't really care about the people in Florida.
I would say that's completely false. He's always very concerned about the constituents. His number one thing is supporting families and ensuring that children are protected and safe in this state.
24-year-old Olivia is against abortion and saw the overturning of Roe as a positive moment for local democracy.
I never really felt that the federal government should have a say in like reproductive rights. And so when you bring it back to the state level, you're bringing it back into the hands of the people. I think with abortion, we kind of lose that humanity. We kind of try to erase it in a sense. Whereas if you just allow those mothers to carry to term and give birth, you do kind of have this humanity of at least, you know, that child dying in the mother's arms.
In April, DeSantis signed a 6-week abortion ban into law, with rape victims allowed up to 15 weeks if they can provide proof. It's pending due to ongoing legal action, but has sparked fury. Democratic Senator Lauren Book was arrested after taking part in a sit-down protest and is now fighting for a state constitutional amendment to allow abortions during the first 3 months.
It makes me angry. It makes me sick to my stomach that on my watch, this happened. And I'll work every day to undo what they've done.
Governor DeSantis has the support of Floridians. Do you not have to accept what he's calling for, what he wants?
They may support this individual, but not necessarily all the ideology or the policy behind it. In fact, we know that 75% of Floridians don't support abortion bans in this way.
Don't support 6-week abortion bans.
Correct. Don't support a 6-week abortion ban. Don't want to go this far. I think he's trying to speak to a very specific base of people, an evangelical religious base outside of Florida for his political ambitions and for a run for president.
Research suggests the majority of abortion patients in the US are considered poor or on a low income. Time off work, childcare, and if they need to travel, fuel and accommodation, the costs stack up, with Black and Hispanic communities disproportionately affected. This clinic in Naples treats unplanned pregnancies. Funded by private donors and local churches, services are free, including ultrasounds. But if a patient wants an abortion, they have to go elsewhere.
I would like to see an outright ban of abortion in America.
Dr. Trandon believes elective abortions physically and mentally harm women. But the broad medical consensus contradicts her, such as the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, which states abortions are a safe medical intervention with fewer risks than childbirth. So what do you think about the argument that ultimately you are entitled to believe what you want, but that shouldn't negate a woman's right to have an abortion if she feels that's what she needs?
I would say there's 2 patients for every woman who is pregnant. It's the woman and the baby. They can continue that pregnancy, which is protective for them emotionally and physically, and offer that child to another family who is in need.
Back in Alabama, we shared Dr. Trandon's views with Dr. Torres. We've heard quite a lot about the traumatic impact of having an abortion that a woman may go on to regret it.
I would question how much that person had been shamed and stigmatized about seeking abortion care. It's not so much the procedure itself, but rather how our society treats people that is the problem.
A year on since the reversal of Roe, 14 states are navigating a new world where a previously held right is no more, while states without restrictions have seen a surge in abortion tourism. And delayed care means increased risk. But for millions, this new direction is the right one, a lifesaver, and they won't rest until there's a nationwide ban.
So assaults, mainly against pro-life protesters or canvassers, represent about 11% of incidents that are discussed in the article. One incident involved a cyber attack, reportedly releasing sensitive data from the Arkansas and Kentucky state governments. Disruptions of church services represent about 3% of the incidents. The database includes one shooting which was not fatal. This incident involved a 74-year-old Michigan man shooting an 84-year-old pro-life canvasser, Joan Jacobson, who was having a disagreement with the perpetrator's pro-choice wife. So there's been a lot of militant activism that followed the murder of George Floyd, and it has involved graffiti, arson, protest, and it is interesting to think about why it is shocking to people, or why it is shocking often to a certain demographic of very privileged people, that those whose lives and rights and economic future will be made even more precarious, particularly poor women, queer women, transgender people, Black women in certain states would not defend their rights. I mean, obviously, if someone is a heterosexual, white, middle class American, then the banning of abortion might not really scare someone as much as a person who is poor and precarious and perhaps lives in neighborhoods or towns or parts of cities where rates of sexual harassment and rape are quite high. So this idea of whose body is considered to be property and whose body is private is also about the universalization of this idea of the gendered body itself. And we've discussed Karl Marx throughout the class, and obviously for Marx, the laboring body is not a universal term. Those who represent the elite of any society, the ruling class, will have a certain ideology about gender and the body, which everyone will be subject to and oppressed by. So if you are someone who is poor and lives in a place with high rates of rape and sexual harassment, obviously the threat to your life because of the refusal of abortion laws is greater. The same is also true of people who are queer and transgender, who might find it traumatic to have to carry a child to term or to give birth to a child. Feminism has also been influenced in the communiques written by these left-wing activists. The third communique, which called for nationwide attacks the night Dobbs was released, was titled Night of Rage, an autonomous call to action against patriarchal supremacy. The term patriarchal appears 8 times in the communiques. One communique mentions a war against patriarchal religious control. So the idea of neutrality is something that academics often promote, and Marx is very clear that there is no neutrality. The ruling ideology is the ideology of the ruling class, and when one claims a position of neutrality, they are actually taking a very conservative position. So refusing to actually take a side or take a position is actually about supporting people who are in positions of power, those who espouse the ruling ideology or the bourgeoisie. So if one refuses to claim a position after the murder of George Floyd, then they are perhaps someone who is a racist or would be an alibi to racists. When people die because of state-led violence and someone claims neutrality, they support state-led violence. The same is true of rape. Taking a neutral stance is obviously about supporting rape. Interestingly, the third communique spent over 100 words discussing the Uvalde school shooting, interpreting it as an act of male domination and patriarchal violence. The statement also said, "We know it is deeply connected to the reproductive violence about to be unleashed on this land by an illegitimate institution founded in white male supremacy." So this is obviously about taking a position, and the point with ideology is that if people who are oppressed by the ideology of the ruling class do not take a position, then they will be subsumed by the kind of interest of the most elite classes of people. So these incidents of shooting and the involuntary celibate movement are perhaps connected to efforts to ban abortion. The desire to control other people's bodies, I think, is central to pro-life activism and to the involuntary celibate movement. So Judith Butler is someone whose work we've discussed in detail already, and Butler discusses the ways that gender is performative. Gender is a term created by post-structuralist feminist philosopher Judith Butler in her book Gender Trouble, which has subsequently been used in a variety of academic fields that describes how individuals participate in social constructions of gender. And so Canada has added transgender rights to the Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code. Bill C-16 adds gender and identity and expression to the Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code. And gender performativity is a term that Butler uses to describe how individuals participate in social constructions of gender. And many authors have argued that reproduction is central to the maintenance of the gender binary. Canadian law is quite clear that one cannot be subject to harassment or discrimination because of gender identity or gender expression that does not coincide with cis normativity or heteronormativity, or is not cis-normative or heteronormative. The subject is constituted the force of exclusion and abjection, one which produces a constitutive outside to the subject, an abjected outside, which is after all inside the subject, as its own founding repudiation. The forming of the subject requires an identification with the normative phantasm of sex, and this identification takes place through a repudiation which produces a domain of abjection, a repudiation without which the subject cannot emerge. So this construction of the abject outside often involves repudiating any sense of queerness from a heterosexual subject, or repudiating gender transgression in order to give the appearance of this kind of seamless set of performatives that have led to a cis-normative identity. However, Butler argues that this kind of form of repudiation will never be complete. One enacts gender not as a kind of natural identity or as an identity that is pre-given, but rather what Judith Butler would argue is that gender involves a series of repetitions and a series of linguistic and performative gestures and rituals throughout the course of one's life. And rather than ever wholly excluding or repudiating forms of gender transgression, one must constantly reassert gender over and over again. So even things like having to remove hair from one's face or body, or having to do physical fitness, is about this sense of constantly working on the body to achieve a certain gender identity. However, and it might seem as though this is personal choice, but Judith Butler discusses abjection in the ways that people who refuse to enact certain performatives are often subject to hate crime, to lesbophobia, homophobia, transphobia. So speaking in a certain voice, using a certain tone, sitting in a certain way with your legs crossed or wide open are all things that we could choose to do differently. However, when one chooses to do these things differently, there are often consequences. And from a young age, even throughout the course of childhood, one is told to do these things properly, or they're shamed, or even subject to some sort of authority, which could even be about the authority of the school system or the healthcare system, to try to discipline people to live in accordance with a certain gender binary. So Butler writes, we may believe that our subjectivity is the source of our actions, but Butler contends that our sense of independent, self-willed subjectivity is really a retroactive construction that comes about only through the enactment of social conventions. A gender cannot be understood as a role which either expresses or disguises an interior self, whether that self is conceived as sexed or not. As performance, which is performative, gender is an act broadly construed, which constructs the social fiction of its own psychological interiority. Gender norms have everything to do with how and in what ways we can appear in public space, how and in what way public and private are distinguished, and how that distinction is instrumentalized in the service of sexual politics, who will be criminalized on the basis of public appearance, who will fail to be protected by the law, or more specifically, the police on the street or on the job or in the home. So how does the materialization of the norm in bodily formation produce a domain of objective bodies, a field of deformation, which, in failing to qualify as the fully human, fortifies those regulatory norms? What challenge does that excluded and abjected realm produce to a symbolic hegemony that might force a radical rearticulation of what qualifies as bodies that matter, ways of living that count as life, lives worth protecting, lives worth saving, lives worth grieving?
The future of your business is here. With Wix, you get advanced AI capabilities.
Across Canada, this has been a day of protest, counter-protest, and even some confrontations over sex ed and LGBTQ rights. This is one of many demonstrations billed as the 1 Million March for Children, with supporters and opponents of the elimination of sexual orientation and gender identity lessons in schools facing off. In Ottawa, about 1,000 people gathered on Parliament Hill. There, 2 people were arrested for displaying hateful material, while a third was arrested for causing a disturbance. The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick has been covering one of today's largest events. She has more details from Toronto.
The protest took place in Queen's Park, just across the street from the Ontario legislature. Earlier this morning, groups started gathering on the south lawn of the legislature, but then moved north to this park where the 2 opposing groups essentially clashed. There was a heavy police presence here, keeping the 2 groups apart, but at times there were some heated confrontations with people in their faces, yelling at each other, waving signs, a scuffle or 2 that police quickly broke up. People here voicing their opinions all around. We spoke to some parents who say they want more parental rights in the education system. They say they want Ontario to follow the example of Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. Those provinces have recently introduced policies that require schools to inform parents if a child decides to use a different name or pronoun. Now, some here saying Ontario should have similar policies. Take a listen.
At the end of the day, we want to have a discussion. We want to establish a dialogue and say, listen, whatever is being taught to our kids, parents should have a right to know about that. It shouldn't take the strong arm of the government to have to come in and kind of force these things through. I think it's great that the education minister has made overtures towards that. And I would hope that both sides can get together and recognize that parents should be the final arbiters of what your children are learning in the classroom.
Education Minister Stephen Lecce did recently express support for the idea of parents being aware and informed, but at this point, there's no indication that Ontario will impose a province-wide policy. Currently, school boards have their own policies. The Toronto District School Board, for example, their policy is that parents would not be informed if a child makes that kind of decision without the child's consent. Again,
So again, we can return to this concept posed by Radhika Rao in her article about privacy and property law. Is the body private to the individual? Is it one's own life, one's own private body and thoughts, or is it property? And if it is property, then it can never really be owned by me because there's no me but my body. My mind is actually in my head, in my body. My voice is in my face or my throat, and it's actually just me and my life. But if the body is property, then yes, it can be owned by others and it can be subject to the authority of others. And this has been a problem in the history of law in North America. And I do think that it is central also to the ways that property law was often used to construct groups of people as slaves and as prisoners who could do forced labor, and also as people who are essentially owned by colonial settlers. So these ideas of the body as being property that is cared for by the state continue to kind of shape these debates. And I think what scares people is the idea that if the body was just privacy, my own life, that can I do whatever I want with my life? And could I do significant harm to myself? And could I do significant harm to others while doing significant harm to myself? And the answer is yes. And I think that the unfortunate truth is that one cannot care for others. And even in the case of childhood, I would argue that children have rights. The problem becomes that if someone is a child, then do they really have the mental capacity to make decisions? And this is something that courts have debated and argued over and over again, particularly in relation to transgender children and in relation to the rights of children. The problem with children's rights is that if we were to say that the body of the child is property of the adult, then what about child abuse? So in certain instances, children could be molested by their caretakers or molested by their teachers. And Canada is obviously a settler colony, and the history of education in Canada is connected to the forced schooling of Indigenous children, which involved numerous incidences of sexual abuse of Indigenous children. So these ideas then of privacy and property, I think, are interesting to think about. Ultimately, the idea that somebody, I think, has their own life and it is not your life, and you don't have control over what they do with their life, and you can only kind of sit at a distance and think that they are making mistakes with their life, I think is somehow anxiety provoking for people who have a strong sense of cultural or national or religious or family values. The idea of nationalism is something that we've also discussed. And Michel Foucault argued that women are often called upon to be what Foucault referred to as the species body, that one is not just someone who has a body, they have a body that is supposed to give birth to a certain species of people. And Anne-Laure Stoller complicated Michel Foucault's writing by discussing colonialism and the ways that specifically white women are often called upon to give birth to white children for the purposes of nation building. And that has happened historically, and I would argue that that is still possible in this time period. And Canadian multiculturalism often works by imagining these kind of ethnic communities that are somehow under colonial rule or self-rule, or not really necessarily part of Canadian society. And women are often called upon to give birth to children who are the property of these communities. And I think that this is extremely disturbing from the perspective of human rights. And a really basic idea, like from the perspective of someone who just wants to live their own life without intervention or without kind of parenting throughout the whole course of one's life, then constructing the body as property can be detrimental to one's capacity to just live their own life. So Pierre Bourdieu is a theorist that authors have drawn upon to discuss abortion, children, and cultural capital. And I will cite this thesis, which was published in 2017, about performative laws and restriction of abortion in the United States. So Pierre Bourdieu states that capital can present itself in three forms: economic capital, which is immediately and directly convertible into money; cultural capital, which can exist in three forms: the embodied state, in the objectified state, and in the institutionalized state. In the form of and so the embodied state, cultural capital, exists in three forms. Firstly, the embodied state is interesting if we think about the form of long-lasting dispossessions of the mind and body. So Canadian niceness is perhaps a form of cultural capital. Many people from other countries or people who have lived elsewhere might not understand why it's so important to be nice all the time, and why silence is often preferred as opposed to speech. So this is a form of cultural capital that someone will learn over time, that one must be nice, and it is perhaps better to not say anything at all. in the objectified state in the form of cultural goods, and in the institutionalized state such as education and diplomas. Social capital is made up of social obligations, connections, and networks. These forms of capital produce specific durable dispositions that are internalized and externalized in practice. The body for Bourdieu becomes the most indisputable materialization of the habitus. So the body then is a materialization of habits, and habits are formed in relation to cultural capital or one's lack of cultural capital. So the kind of class position that one can occupy depends not only on financial capital, but on how one can wield cultural capital to become someone who is viewed as an upstanding middle class professional, who can use language in certain ways, who can smile in certain ways, who is a consumer, who can wear certain clothing, who consumes certain products, and who can have a certain amount of education. So cultural capital is non-financial assets. So you could have a lot of money, but if you cannot wield this cultural capital, you can only really obtain a certain amount of class privilege. And so Bourdieu is interested in the ways that classism and elitism and class antagonism is not just about money. It is about how people who were born and raised in a certain society know how to wield cultural capital. So the appearance of the human body, how we dress, the way we speak, having a certain accent are all forms of cultural capital. And if you understand certain social codes, then you can use cultural capital to wage a kind of class war against people who are working class. So if you are working class and you have cultural capital, you can engage in a class war against other working class people who do not have as much cultural capital as you. And the body is central often to how people who are working class try to become middle class because of skin color, because of appearance, because of accent, niceness. It involves this kind of use of non-financial assets to as a form of class mobility. And the gendered body is obviously central to how someone can self-present as a cisgender heterosexual white male and obtain more class privilege by waging class warfare against other people that they once knew and perhaps don't have to know in the future because of class mobility. So abortion stigma is central to the ways that gender identity becomes a form of cultural capital. So someone who has an abortion is often stigmatized and is not seen to have the kind of cultural capital to use the body in ways that are deemed appropriate by middle class heterosexual white Christian society. So according to Merlot, who draws on Anuradha Kumar, Leela Hassani, and Ellen M.H. Mitchell, abortion stigma is a negative attribute ascribed to women who seek to terminate a pregnancy that makes them internally or externally as inferior to ideals of womanhood. Thus, a woman who seeks an abortion is inadvertently challenging wide-held assumptions about the essential nature of women, such that female sexuality is solely for procreation and motherhood is the inevitable role for women. The notion that motherhood and womanhood go together and that they mutually define one another has rarely been open to debate. For this reason, women who electively choose to have abortions are seen as particularly destabilizing to societal order. So cultural capital is not really about doing whatever you want to do. It isn't really even a kind of libertarian position or a kind of free position. It is really about a social order. And so even if you have a certain amount of money, and you're a woman, if you kind of violate certain social codes, then your claims to cultural capital can be challenged. Even in the professional work world, saying that you are I guess, married, have a heterosexual married and have children could actually support your career ambitions and aspirations because of this societal order. And this is obviously not about the law, but cultural capital is really something that Pierre Bourdieu discusses over and over again as a sociologist who is interested in class relations and power. That class is not just about money and is not about the law. It is about understanding certain cultural codes, certain ways of speaking. And I would argue that transgender rights and queer rights and the capacity that cis het women have to transgress gender norms and become trans or lesbians is something that really scares people and makes people very anxious who are part of the heterosexual white Christian middle class. So in The Woman in the Body, Emily Martin writes that women's bodies are often described as if they were mechanical factors or centralized production systems. Through the medical metaphor of production, the physician can be seen as a supervisor and the woman a laborer whose machine uterus produces the product, babies. While the medical metaphor of production is not explicitly stated in the mandatory counseling laws examined above about people who want abortions and involves interpreting the indirect meaning conveyed by the discourse, I feel that the medical metaphor of production can be aptly applied to analyzing the intent of the legislatures in implementing the mandatory counseling. So this takes us back to Marx. So Karl Marx obviously discussed the factory worker, and the factory worker was someone who had never owned the means of production, and their life was perhaps a grueling life of grueling labor. However, the factory worker's actual body was not supervised under constant scrutiny by someone who pretended that being a supervisor of a factory is a great love story. So in responding to the question, does life make law or does law make life? Catherine McKinnon argues that when men make both and you are a woman, the distinction may not count for much, except that law purports to have rules other than force and pretends to be accountable where life does not. So by using the term mother, the law powerfully classifies, drawing the distinction between a woman and an individual with constitutional rights, and when this individual becomes pregnant, a mother. So if someone has sex and doesn't use a condom, I guess they are a mother at that point. So if you just happen to have sex without using a condom, you become this person who is a mother, whose private body and reproductive decisions can be controlled by the power of the law. It's actually just really shocking that someone can think about the human body and life in this way, which is again about property. And I would go back to the kind of rational thought process that I had, or the kind of just actual idea that my body is property and that there's a separate person outside of myself who is me, who is doing what I want with my property. I mean, unless the human body could actually be owned by another person, then how could the body actually be property? I don't have a mind that owns my genitalia. I just have one body and one life. So I don't really understand how someone's body could be controlled as property by the state, because essentially then someone's mind could also be controlled by the state, and then someone's mind and body and life could be owned by the state, which takes us back to the history of slavery in America.
Highest art.
And even in instances where someone wants to kill themselves, Canada's laws are clear. Yes, you can kill yourself. People can also smoke and drink. People can have sex without contraception. People can actually do significant damage to their own life if they choose to. And no, the state does not really take responsibility for people. If one is going to say that someone must be cared for because of their poor decision-making skills, then that would also involve responsibility, which would mean financial responsibility. And in certain instances where somebody, if I was to be hit by a car, then I have free healthcare in Canada. So yes, the state would take some responsibility for me. But if I want the Canadian government to give me money because I choose not to work, then no, I have to take responsibility for myself. Like, I don't understand how the human body could really be property and why it is not privacy and a private life.
This idea of butterfly politics is an activist concept. What it means is that the right, small, simple intervention into an unstable political system can ultimately produce large, complex, system-wide changes. It's really a strategic idea about law, about how to go in, where to go in, when to go in. It's how sometimes one case or one word in legislation can produce a major social transformation. The concept came out of my 40 years of law practice challenging sex inequality. And sex inequality is, as I see it, an unstable system because it is based on the lie that women are inferior to men. And what I've done is gone specifically after what I see to be the crucial juncture in sex inequality, and that is sexual abuse. So in 1972, the scientist Conrad Lorenz asked the question, does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? When he answered yes, he conceived of what has come to be called the butterfly effect. Some properly targeted, extremely small actions like the butterfly wing can eventually have very large effects that can be difficult to foresee or predict. The idea then became central to a much larger theory called chaos theory, which is not about things being chaotic. It's about things being either irregular or extremely complex, or the causality turning back in on itself in ways that is hard to predict or foresee. And it's used these days, for example, to predict the weather. So it produces a series of, the following alternative models could play out. And that's partly why sometimes you see weather predicted as, it could be like this, but the range of possibilities are as follows. So chaos, as I say, doesn't mean lack of pattern. It doesn't mean disorder. Only that the patterns are not immediately clear, that they aren't linear. The causality is complex, it's interactive, and it's repetitive, which to me sounds a lot like law and society. So among the things that I've learned in this practice, and in thinking about it in retrospect in terms of butterfly politics, is that changing the power structure involved, and in my work, it's male dominance, and I've focused specifically on sexual harassment, on rape in and out of genocide, on pornography, and on prostitution, and an emerging theory from all of that of what is now being called, and I've called, substantive equality, which is a different approach to equality than the standard legal approach. The things I've learned is that this project is a collective one. It is not in any way an individual one. It takes a movement. Also, it is deeply contextual and grounded, meaning it's not isolated in its setting, and it springs from the realities of social life and relationships within social life. Now, sexual harassment as a practice, according to me, happens because of the sex of the victim and the perpetrator in a culture that encourages and permits sexual predation by dominant groups on subordinate ones. In substance, that is, in content, it is a form of gender-based discrimination. Whoever it is doing what to whoever they are doing it to. So before this, sexual abuse had never been conceived as part of sex inequality. But doing so in law, because it actually is a practice of sex inequality in life, has had a massive systemic effect, politically and legally, all around the world. Law's power to change lies in its capacity, which we give it, to restore a piece of the humanity that the victimization took away. It is this chunk of wholeness, this possibility, this hope for it, that lawyers for violated people, whether rightfully vindicated or wrongfully convicted, hold in their hands. Butterfly politics can animate political activism and support equality advocacy toward this kind of legal change. These small actions in a collective context can change systems, both internationally and domestically. It encourages multidimensional political thinking, precise engagement, principled creativity, imagination, instinct, and adaptability. It inspires interventions, even tiny ones. It opens discussion and debate on strategy and substance as part of a disciplined process of transformation toward equality, including equality of the sexes. It envisions and joins hands with old and new forms of organizing. Because in isolation and in image, butterflies are delicate, even fragile. They can be overlooked or reduced to decoration. But in life, their endurance lies in their collectivity. Their power lies in their collective effect. On its life journey, a butterfly can be collected and categorized. It can die for lack of nutrition, or it can be smashed against a windshield. Yet still, we rise everywhere. So I say, equality seekers, spread your wings. You're stronger than you know. And what butterflies can set in motion, sometimes even one, cannot be stopped.
So the banning of abortion throughout many states in America has led to waves of activism, and it has led to many different forms of political mobilization, including many impassioned lawyers who have challenged the ruling in different ways, and also grassroots activism. There have been really disturbing cases that have emerged in the US media. A 7th grader in Mississippi who was raped at the age of 12 years old, gave birth to a child at the age of 13 years old. So when people are raped, they're often, especially young girls, are often confused about the law and are unclear as to who to talk to or who to tell, because the laws have been changing so rapidly. So amid confusion over what abortion care is even allowed in certain states like Mississippi, people who are raped, especially young girls, end up having children at a very young age. And from the perspective of medical health, this is extremely dangerous. And from a psychological perspective, it is without any real moral conscience. So Catherine McKinnon writes in Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, man fucks Man fucks woman, subject, verb, object. So that is the lecture. And there's one more for this week. And if you haven't handed in your presentation, please do so. And you can also hand in your final assignment and your self-assessment mark at the end of the class, which is in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much. I hope you are all doing well.